Welcome to another edition of CHP Talks. We are talking today about restorative justice, and we have a special guest with us, Chris Cowie. And Rod, why don't you give him a full introduction, and then we can get on to our topic for the day.
Yes, good morning, and thanks for joining us, Chris. Chris has been a senior manager in community charities related to justice, anti-poverty, community development, and international missions since 1988. Before that, he was the executive director of 2 Kitchener agencies. He's consulted on resource development, organizational development, and strategic planning for charities and small businesses. He's been a member of several boards, and he's worked in various church leadership capacities. He was the president of the Ontario Association of Community Correctional Residences for 2 terms, and currently he's chairing the Waterloo Regional Crime Prevention Council. He received his MA in leadership from the University of Guelph. And in 1989, while working with young offenders at another agency, he collaborated with community justice initiatives to develop a victim-offender reconciliation program. And witnessing the power of restorative justice, he became a strong proponent of using restorative practices in responses to many kinds of crime and conflict. He likes hockey, cooking, and good literature. He's married with 2 children, 2 stepchildren, and 4 grandchildren. So again, thank you for joining us today, Chris. Nice to have you with us.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Thanks. So yeah, why don't I just maybe begin by it's a long sort of introduction, a lot of different things, but I still remember very vividly when I go back to the late 1980s. I was working in a custody facility for young offenders. So essentially, it's like a jail kind of environment for young offenders, but it was operated by a private organization back in the mid 1980s, when the Young Offenders Act changed the Juvenile Delinquents Act, which was a very outdated act at the time. The government of Ontario specifically were just not prepared to implement a lot of the new provisions within that act, and had to reach out to a number of community organizations, a lot of them being charitable organizations, in order to provide young offender services. So we ended up with this kind of strange system in Ontario with a lot of charitable organizations, Salvation Armies and St. Leonard's and a whole variety of others, and the organization that I worked for, that were contracted to provide these custodial services for young offenders, 2 different designations, secure and open custody. Anyway, I got a job working in a custody facility, and I'm one of these people where, I had this strange sort of preoccupation with everything to do with prison when I was young. I was going to end up there one way or another. And thank goodness I ended up there in a good sort of way. And I guess, like a lot of other people, I just kind of assumed that the things that went on in these places were actually good, that they actually were somehow helpful. And here I was working in this facility, and it took me very little time to realize that even with the best possible programming, the kind of impact that we were having on these young guys was very, very minimal. And I had only been working in the facility for a very short period of time, probably a couple of months. And I had just a very formative thing happen to me one evening. I was working the night shift, and that meant that I would come in the evening right around supper time. And after supper, I would work with a number of the guys in the kitchen, just cleaning up after supper. And so I was in the kitchen, I was alone, and I had about half a dozen guys in there. And it was one of these residents who had been somebody who, he was kind of a volatile young guy. He was always causing trouble. He was always a bit of a risk. And on this particular day, he was agitating me. I can't remember exactly what was going on, but he was really ramping it up. And there were a number of others that were kind of getting into it too. And he said something, and again, I don't remember what it was, but it kind of set me off. And normally I was very good at being able to de-escalate guys and just sort of calm them down. But I got kind of right in his face. And I have to tell you, like, this is in the late 80s. I was about 23, 24 at the time. I looked like I was about 16. This kid was probably about 18. He looked like he was about 30 years old. He was much bigger than me, a lot tougher. And I just said to him, I said, I'm really tired of the way that you act. You never accept responsibility for what you do. And I wasn't prepared for how he was going to respond to that. He got really angry. I mean, he was really hot. His fists were like this. And he picked up, and I often say, I wish that it was I wish for dramatic purposes that he picked up a big knife or something, but he picked up this big metal spoon and he smashed it down on the countertop, and he got right up into my face. And he said, "How can you say that I don't accept responsibility? Because I'm here." So I was a little freaked out by what was going on, and I was a little baffled by this comment, which I didn't understand at the time. And so I sent him upstairs to his room, and I sent the other guys up as well. And I called my partner upstairs and said, he's a little hot. He's in his room. Well, I'll come up and I'll chat with him in a bit and calm him down. Anyway, later on that night, working the night shift, I would work alone for the rest of the night. So I had all night to sort of think about this. And as I was thinking about it, I understood what had actually happened. And somehow when I told him, "You never accept responsibility for what you do," he thought I was talking about the crime that had actually landed him in the facility. And it was a fairly serious crime. He had done some rather serious assaults, and he had really harmed a lot of people. And what he was saying to me was that his understanding of what it meant to accept responsibility for his behavior was that he was now in this custody facility. In other words, a third party had punished him, put him in there, and for him that constituted accepting responsibility. And for me, that just didn't add up. And that was the moment when I first asked the question, is there ever a time when people are actually made to accept responsibility in some kind of direct and meaningful way to the people who they've actually harmed? And so I asked this question of a number of my colleagues and some people that I was working with at the time. And as it turned out, there was this organization that was literally a 10-minute walk from the facility that I was working in Kitchener. And this organization was called Community Justice Initiatives, and they did what was called Restorative Justice Programming. And they did this form of victim offender reconciliation, where they would bring victims together with the offenders and facilitate a process where people could come up with a different kind of solution outside of a regular justice system. And so I was really intrigued by this, and I was very interested in trying to do something and set it up for the young offenders that I had been working with. Now, to make a long story short, it was an extraordinarily difficult process because the Ministry of Corrections, who was our funding ministry at the time, were not really amenable to the idea, and also the act itself had such a high value on confidentiality that it made it extremely difficult to have the kind of proper forms done and everything else, and parental consent so we could do it. But after about a year, we finally had that program up and running. And from that time forward, I ended up facilitating many cases myself, bringing victims together with these young offenders. And what I would see was absolutely transformational. It was something that I would witness the change in behavior in a resident, in a young boy, 16, 17, 18, generally was the age group that I was working with, that months and months of the best possible programming could not bring about that kind of change. Now, let me tell you the story about CJI, because that's an interesting one as well. So back in 1974, there was an interesting case that happened in the town of Elmira, which is just about 20 minutes north of here. There were two young guys one night that were drinking in their car, and the police pulled them over, saw that they were drinking, and of course 1974 was a little bit different time than it is now. So the police just basically said, pour out your booze out the window of your car. So they made them pour it out, and they said, now just go home. And these two guys kind of looked at each other and said, you want to go home? No, and they kind of decided that they want to cause a little bit of trouble. So they ended up causing quite a bit of trouble in that town. And the town of Elmira is it's kind of a small town, or at least it was then, very quiet place that people would sort of go and move to in order to get away from, some of the perceived dangers of the city. And now, on this one famous evening, these guys did all of these damage to these homes. They went up and down a street, and by the end of the evening, they had committed 22 acts of willful vandalism. They slashed tires, they broke windows, they knocked over stop signs, they pushed over somebody's boat in their driveway. They made a real mess. These guys were assigned to a probation officer, a young probation officer, not very experienced, but he was experienced enough to realize that what was going to happen to these guys was they would go before the judge, they would get sentenced to jail, they would go to jail, and like everybody else, and like my experience many years later, they would go to jail and they would come out in much worse condition than what they went in. So not really being rehabilitated, not really learning a lesson, but actually coming out a little bit angrier than what they went in, and possibly even a little bit more adept at being able to commit the kind of crimes that they had done. And so this probation officer wrote a little note on the back of the pre-sentence report to the judge, and he made this comment that he thought there might be some therapeutic value in these guys actually meeting with their victims. Now the judge was kind of a hard-nosed judge, and nobody expected that to go anywhere. So people were kind of shocked when this judge said, "Tell me a little bit about, your idea here." And the probation officer was a humble guy, and he said, "Well, I think there might be some merit to that." And so the judge said, "Well, I think so too. So why don't you do that?" Now, this is not at all the way we do things anymore. It's kind of kind of a funny story when I think about it now, but they literally took these two young guys and they put them in the back of the car, and they said, and they drove them to the town of Elmira, and they made them go and knock on the doors of these people's homes that they had vandalized unannounced, and they would introduce themselves and say, like, we're the two young guys that smashed your windows or slashed your tires, and they had the opportunity to be able to sort of apologize and to actually offer to make restitution for the damage that they'd caused. So it was a little awkward, but there were some very compelling things that happened. They actually did meet with all of those victims. We actually made a movie about this several years ago, which is very much worth watching. And one of these young guys now, looking back on this thing and how this event just was a life-changing kind of thing for him. But there were a couple of things that happened that day that really kind of spoke to this probation officer. One was that these young guys actually got a good, real understanding of the impact of their crime. One of the things that I would see with so many young offenders, especially when they're removed from the crime, is that actually understanding the impact on a victim is something that's completely lost on them. In fact, for the most part, particularly with young people, they see the crime in terms of the financial value of what they've damaged or stolen. And so oftentimes they're very quick to say, "Oh, I'm willing to pay for the damage." And what they actually hear from people is that the financial damage is the minimal thing. It's the least thing that really matters to most people. And what these boys heard was, "Listen, we're not poor. We were able to fix the windows. I was able to get my tire fixed. But my wife and my kids had to go and stay at, my wife's sister's house for 2 weeks because we were afraid somebody was going to come back. And our safety was compromised. The kind of peace that I have when I walk into my home, that was now destroyed." And that is the first time when someone really comes to an understanding of, "Oh, I actually did this and caused this other kind of damage." It produces this different kind of thing inside, which I have seen over and over and over again, which actually brings a person to an understanding and brings them to a place where an apology is not just a superficial thing. There's a heartfelt desire to make things right and to repair that relationship. And on the other side of the equation, what we see in a lot of victims are people who, especially in the absence of being able to see their actual perpetrator, the person who offended against them, they tend to conjure up a monster who's just obsessed with doing this horrible thing, who's going to come back. And all they see is this act, and they can't somehow separate the human being from this thing that's happened. And so for some of these people who had this encounter with these young guys, at first they were sort of taken aback. One of the stories is an older lady who, when they said, we're the guys that did that and broke your window, she kind of took a step back, immediately being afraid. There had been this period of time and it had not gone away. There was this fear factor that was there. But as you see a young person who was drunk one night and did some stupid things, and you realize that that's really what we're dealing with here. A young person who, no question, did some wrong things that they need to accept responsibility for, but it's not the entirety of who they are. Somehow it begins to make sense, and that person is humanized. And so then it eases the way for a victim to be able to articulate exactly how they've been impacted, and it's meaningful for them when they actually see someone want to make amends. And so all of the stories that happened that day, and as I say, there were like 22 people that they met with, it was on the strength of those that young probation officer said, we actually need to somehow formalize this process, and eventually they founded the organization of community justice initiatives in order to be able to carry on that work. That method of doing things became our victim offender reconciliation program. The term restorative justice kind of came in around that same time, a new way of being able to imagine justice where rather than what we always do, which is basically single out the person who's done something wrong and come up with some kind of punishment for them and ignore the needs of the victim, actually bringing people together and facilitating their being able to come to some sort of a meaningful kind of solution to things. I often describe it this way, and I could speak about this for a long, long time. As I say, I teach restorative justice at the University of Waterloo, and I often feel that at the end of 13 weeks of going through a lot of detail around restorative justice, we're still barely scratching the surface. So it's difficult to sort of capture exactly how important it is and all of the things that are going on in the restorative process in a short period of time. But really, when we look at how we look at the concept of justice, in a Western society, we see things through what I would say is very much a legal lens. And that means that we are kind of obsessed with what law was actually broken, and all our resources go into determining what line was actually crossed, what law was actually broken, and the rest of our resources go to figuring out how can we actually punish this person, and then we spend an enormous amount actually punishing that human being. And we punish them in a way that is kind of divorced from the actual impact of what they've done. It's kind of like we punish them on behalf of all of us. That's that idea that a crime is committed against the state and not an individual. I don't see things that way. Crimes are committed against people, and there are direct victims. There are people who are impacted by that, and then there's a peripheral kind of community that's also impacted. So looking at wrongdoing from a relational kind of lens says, what actually happened here? Who was harmed, and how were they harmed? What's it going to take to make things right? Now, if you were assaulted by somebody who you knew, and I was assaulted by somebody I knew, and we just looked at these two crimes, we would say it's exactly the same thing. How that impacts me and why is a very different thing than you. It does not make sense for us to come up with a one-size-fits-all kind of response to that and expect that all of us are going to be satisfied. And yet we've sold that to many people so that so many victims will even have this false sense that once a person is sentenced and punished, now I'm going to feel satisfied. And that's why after that happens, generally you'll see victims who are not satisfied. So we need to sort of shift to that relational lens where we're not so much obsessed with exactly what line was crossed, exactly what rule was broken, but how did what you do actually, or what you did, how did it actually impact another person? And what's it going to take to repair that? We focus a lot on the relationships involved in things, and it's not just the human relationships. I talk about, the break and enter thing. Oftentimes when we're doing case development with victims, one of the questions that we'll ask that most victims, it kind of catches them off guard is, how has the relationship with your house changed since this incident? Because if your house is a place that is your sort of refuge and your place of safety at the end of a long workday, and now you've had this experience of somebody breaking into your home and violating that, each time that you come home, your relationship with that entire environment has now been altered in a way that is different. And that's something that needs to be considered. The person who's actually caused the damage needs to hear that relationship has been fractured and needs to hear, what will it take for me to have that restored? And oftentimes that is an apology, an acceptance of that, a sense that this person really understands and they're not going to do it again, and that restores that sort of sense of harmony. Now, again, I'm squashing this into a few seconds, but that's essentially what's going on in that kind of a restorative process. Now, we do a lot of different programs at community justice initiatives, and we still do victim offender reconciliation, where we get our referrals that come directly out of adult court, and we bring victims together with perpetrators for a variety of different types of crimes and situations, and assist them to be able to resolve something and come to some sort of meaningful agreement. And it's an excellent process, and it's an extremely successful process. We also use a lot of those restorative principles and practices. We bring them to a variety of different places where conflict happens. So we deal with a lot of community-related conflict. It can come from bylaw, or it can just come from neighborhood associations and people self-referring. We do a lot of work in the seniors community. There's a lot of conflict around seniors. We do family-related work. We do a lot of work in the area of sexual harm. We work with survivors of sexual harm. We also work with offenders, people that have committed sexual offenses. We work with both male and female. In fact, we were one of the first organizations in the province, if not the first one, to actually work with male survivors before it was even recognized that there was such a thing as male survivors. And we do facilitated dialogue, where it's a similar kind of process, except it's a much more protracted process. It takes a long time and a lot of case development, where we work where there's lots of or long-term sort of historical family sexual abuse that's taken place, and bringing people together. And we do a lot of other programs as well, and we're an organization that's always kind of innovating new restorative responses to the types of conflict and crime that we're seeing in our community. There's a lot of crime right now that's sort of in the hate crime category. We have a very interesting program that we do in partnership with the Coalition for Muslim Women, where we're dealing with people that have been attacked basically because they're Muslim, and those programs are going extraordinarily well as well. So I don't know if you have any other sort of questions, or what area I can sort of move in that might be helpful or might be interesting to the people who are listening today.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for giving us all of that for starters. And I know that you had mentioned to me that this week is a Restorative Justice Week, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. I found out about you back in 2014 at a CHP convention when you were a speaker, and so and your stories had never really left me because they're powerful and they speak of justice, and there's that deep sense of I think when justice hasn't been served, it never really goes away. We can't totally forget when there's an unresolved issue of injustice, and so I think that's why this speaks so powerfully.
It does, and it's not uncommon to hear things like that. The power is in the stories. It's interesting how if you look at most entertainment that's around things with crime, what's really exciting on the screen is revenge. What's really exciting on the screen is a courtroom drama where two lawyers battle it out, and we don't know who's going to win. But we never get to see the aftermath of how victims end up living out the rest of their lives. We're just kind of left with this idea that, well, if we caught the bad guy and we put him away, then I guess everybody else is now happy. The community's healed and the victim is healed as well. What doesn't really work in the entertainment so well is a serious crime followed by people actually working it out with each other. And yet, when you tell the stories, the real stories, that's where it's very, very compelling. And while we can bring a camera into a courtroom, I would never let a camera be brought into a restorative process. Part of what makes it so effective is that circle is left kind of small. There's sort of a biblical principle even that if your brother offends you, go and have a chat with him. And if he's not really listening, bring along somebody else with you. And then if he's still not listening, then we sort of go a little bit wider. But that principle is something that I even see us abandon a lot of the time. The smaller that circle is, why do we do it in private? Because it's never really a comfortable experience to have somebody say, you hurt me and I think you did something wrong. No one likes to hear that. But if they're going to come to terms with their own wrongdoing and want to make things right, it's much more likely to happen if that circle is small. As soon as that's advertised to 100 other people, now you've got some face that needs to be saved. And the likelihood of you wanting to sort of confess that to everybody is reduced greatly. There's a reason why we do that. And so those stories can't always, I can share a lot of the stories. I can put different names on them and I can share them. But that's why often reading a book just about restorative justice and the process is really, really dull. But actually understanding what's going on there and hearing the stories can be a very powerful thing. We're excited that restorative justice has become something that is so renowned across the world that we've actually dedicated a week for restorative justice stuff. So yes, I can't remember exactly when this started, but it's probably about 15 years now that we've had a restorative justice week in November, and often have the opportunity to speak in a number of different places and carry on events and do things to be able to highlight the need for restorative justice and highlight just how important it really is.
So, Chris, I think you know that CHP's policies historically have been based on restitution in the case of property crimes and public safety in terms of if someone has been physically injured, a sexual crime, or the worst case murder, that there's a real concern that is prevented from happening again, the deterrence factor. And I think generally in society, there is a lot of concern for deterrence I think we see our society going down a pretty bumpy road. And, there's no doubt in my mind over recent years that crime has been increasing. And I kind of, I was going to ask you your opinion on this, whether that has to do with a departure from Christian values or, generally a society moving away from the concept that there is a right and wrong and that, God is watching over and that we have a personal responsibility, and tied into, broken homes and broken lives, drug use, all kinds of things. It's a tremendously complex issue. But I think, many of us have felt that the lack of deterrence, a deterrent value of punishment as such, it's not for punishment's sake, but for deterrence value. So I guess I'm asking in terms of property crimes where something can be repaired, a window can be repaired, or so on, along with the healing of relationship or the bearing of one's soul and sharing the pain of the victim with the contrition of the perpetrator. But there are like rape or physical damage, certainly murder. Isn't there, I guess I'm going to ask your opinion whether incarceration still has a role in all that. Like how do you see the correctional system? We all agree that the correctional system has not corrected everything, and I don't think it can. I think there's things that are going on a deeper level with people that an institution can't fix. But how do you see this working together? Because a crime of rape or certainly murder is, as well as a crime against an individual, it is a crime against society as well. And how do we fit that together in a way that brings a proper deterrent value to whatever approach we take, maybe including restorative justice?
That would take a long, long time for me to sort of go into a lot of the things that you've said there. But on the surface, I will say a few things that probably are sort of in disagreement with the position that you're in this. Harsh punishment is not a deterrent, and it never has been. It does not deter crime. It's been shown over and over again. So if we elevate the consequences of certain things, it has zero impact on that. it doesn't stop some of those significant things, particularly if we're going to talk about something like a sexual assault, a serious sexual assault, or things like murder. Those things are never deterred. Nobody contemplates a murder and simply doesn't do it because they're not going to get caught. The same way nobody really thinks about it when they're involved in it, and we can see lots of those things. A lot of the work that needs to be done needs to be more on the prevention side. If we actually want to protect ourselves, we do need to prevent. The prisons that we have, our correctional system, is the worst possible response to the things if we're actually trying to prevent future crime. So there are three types of crime prevention, or basically, I mean, there's what we call primary crime prevention, where you're doing things and attacking root causes right at the very beginning. The root causes of crime are things like unemployment and things like mental health problems and things like poverty. Wherever we begin to sort of alleviate some of those things, we will tend to see less crime. And then we have secondary, which is the targeted sort of things, where we might have a particularly diverse neighborhood that has all kinds of problems that we see on the surface. So we'll focus our programming there. And then there's tertiary, which is what we do in response when something's already happened in order to prevent it from happening again. And what we know is that our recidivism rates are sky high, and punishment, especially the kind of punishment that happens in our correctional system, it does more damage than it does good. When someone is generally punished, the response to that is to feel that they've been stigmatized and to feel that they've been singled out, and it produces a kind of anger. It may produce some deterrent factor in terms of not wanting to commit that particular act again, but generally what we see is that anger come out and act out in other aggressive ways, and so that's why we have such sky-high recidivism rates. When we bring somebody into more of a restorative process, which begins to try and build that empathy, where they begin to see what's happened in another person, that becomes the deterrent. That is the thing that will deter someone. When they come to an understanding of how they've actually violated someone else and how they've actually harmed the community around them, that becomes the agent of change within someone. If we have programs that will address some of the risk factors, so if people have precipitating factors like alcohol problems and relationship difficulties and all of those things, even the programs themselves that are designed to address those things, in the absence of them wanting to do that and understanding the motivation being for them not to be causing that harm again, those programs become rather useless. So I've seen this an awful lot. I also think, and I'm very, very critical of our correctional systems that way. We have especially in Canada, we have a very sanitized understanding of what actually goes on in our prisons. They are places where people in power take advantage of others and cause enormous amounts of damage. We damage people's ability to negotiate relationships in their life. We damage their ability to actually accept responsibility for things. I mean, all the things that we want to see in a prison and what we want to see in response to crime. If the profile of a typical person who finds themselves in a prison is somebody who has difficulty being responsible in their own life, like literally not being able to hang on to a job, not being able to make wise decisions, not being able to manage money properly, not being able to negotiate relationships properly. If they are people who act out in violence and we want them to change that way, we put them into an environment where they're never able to sort of test what responsibility really is. We tell them when to get up in the morning, when they're going to eat their breakfast, when they can go to the bathroom. We don't give them any sense of how to accept responsibility for the daily things and routines in their life. We also put them in an environment where if they do not act with violence, they're going to die. So we put them in a place where they must act out in ways that are completely contrary to what we want when they're going to be reintegrated. And then we have no programs to reintegrate them. Now, we do a lot of reintegration programs at Community Justice Initiatives. It's sort of an extension of restorative justice that we're doing that kind of thing. But those are some of the things that we actually further the problems. Plus, we remove them from their families. And so then the families kind of split up and become problematic. And then we We saddle them with a criminal record, so it becomes more difficult for them to get employment, more difficult for them to get housing properly. With women, that's even worse. The women that come out of prison, their families usually blown apart when they come out, and the kids might be with grandma, or the kids might be in child welfare, and now they're expected to sort of put together a home, have a place where they can actually keep their kids. It just does so many destructive things. It's not really the answer. So I'm not trying to pretend that every single time we can bring people together and there's going to be a willingness to see the other side of things. Restorative justice is something that's really based on people being willing and wanting to accept the truth of what's happened. So that's not the way that it's not going to work all the time. But the current kind of response to that doesn't deter things the way we would like it to, and it doesn't contribute to them actually contributing to things in our communities in a better way. We need to have a different way of being able to approach a lot of these problems.
Wow, that's quite a condemnation of the current system, and I think it's something that probably most of our listeners have never really heard explained that way. It doesn't sound like tough on crime, and yet what you're saying is that if you want to actually deal with crime, the current system isn't working.
No, it's not. It's not the term that often gets used now is more like we have to be smart on crime. I mean, tough on crime is just sort of killing us all. It's just making things worse. Any country that you look at, the higher the incarceration rates, the higher the higher the crime rates are, the more difficult social problems there are. It's the places that have much different approaches that are actually being a lot more they're being a lot more successful with that. You talk about what are the overriding factors that are causing this, and you'll say, is it just a general deterioration of morality and us understanding the difference between right and wrong less? I don't believe that's the case. Now, I think that for some of those rights and wrongs, people who would live in your community will see certain things that way. But we're not talking about those things. Let's talk about the things that everybody knows are the wrong things. We don't break into other people's homes. We don't assault people. We don't murder people. We don't commit sexual crimes against each other. I think there's an elevated understanding of those things being wrong in our communities. There are more and more efforts. There's more and more coming to light so that men can understand how they're supposed to actually treat the opposite sex in a way that doesn't contribute to those things. There are things we know about raising our boys so that they're not raising them with an attitude of that's going to lead to those types of problems. But those problems still persist. We still see them a lot. And I think a lot of it is because we're not doing enough of the prevention things, and we're not responding to them in a way where people actually come to an understanding of how they've harmed somebody else. And so it takes a lot more, there's a lot more complexity to it than simply saying, if you do this, it's now going to be something, we're going to have a really serious consequence for you. Doesn't seem to change the behavior at all.
Well, thank you so much for really opening up a topic that hopefully many of us will want to look into a little bit further. Again, the organization you work for is Community Justice Initiatives, and it's obviously provincially based in Ontario, but there's, I believe, other ones across the country that people might want to look into. And sorry.
Well, I have to say I'm not where you're at with this discussion. I appreciate the insight into restorative justice. I think you've hit some important topics, but I there's a couple of things that are important to me, and that is, God has a sense of justice, and there is, I believe there's a place for punishment, not for its own sake, but for deterrence and for public safety. And so the Bible says, because sentence against evil is not executed speedily, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. And I think, like I go back to my previous statement, we have allowed people to forget that God has moral, a sense of right and wrong. So I want to absorb as much as I can of what you've presented, and yet I have to honestly say that I'm not prepared to go where you are yet at this point in time, but I appreciate you sharing that with our audience.
Let me just leave you with one other thing, though. Okay, Jesus also said when he looked at the law, and he said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." And really, the eye and an eye and a tooth for a tooth is a representation of the entire law of Moses. That's what it was meant to. You've heard it said, this is the way it is. But now I tell you this. So Jesus was going to move something from a different place. This is this change from a legal lens for, this is the way we deal with everything, to a relational lens. But I tell you this, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn in the other also. Now we hear that all the time, but the phrase that he slips in before that is, do not resist an evildoer. Our systems are designed to simply resist those who are evildoers, put them away so we don't have to pay attention to them. And Jesus' entire life was spent engaging those people who did those things, because it's through that engagement that we actually begin to change behavior and we create the kind of community that we actually want. I believe that's what we want. I'm not suggesting that there are people who don't need to be isolated at times for our safety. They do. But for us to cause them further harm does nobody any good. And I don't believe that's what God wants us to do. I don't believe he wants us to harm people simply because they've harmed. So yeah, we could disagree a little bit on those things.
Yeah. Well, and there is the difference between the role of the state and the role of the individual. Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek, but I believe the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And so this bears further discussion, and appreciate you for opening the window of understanding for us to look at another side of things today.
And I very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about it.
And let's, as Rod mentioned earlier, CHP does have this idea already in our policies of restitution and of reconciliation where possible. And so we definitely appreciate this contribution, Chris, today, and we hope that, as I said, everyone will have learned something and look at restorative justice again. And maybe it's been badly explained to you in the past if you're a listener, and I hope it's been explained to you well today. I know I've learned some things, and so thanks again, and we hope that you'll join us again for another edition of CHP Talks to all of our listeners next week.
I wanted to ask one more question. Chris, you said there was a movie made about these two young fellows. What's the name of the movie, and is it available online? Or?
Yeah, you can actually order it right through on our website, and it's called the Elmira Case. It's a 16-minute documentary on the Elmira case, and it features Russ, one of the young men that was involved in that, and one of the victims as well. So it gives you and the young probation officer who was the founder of the organization, who's a good friend of mine, Mark Yancey, is in there as well. So yeah, it's worth a look. All
right. Well, thanks for that, and God bless you, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you very much.